And we use edibles to treat PTSD. So, from a neuroscience perspective, PTSD makes a lot of sense. So, basically, it's like a problem with your memory system. So, you have cues associated with a previous traumatic event. So, something like a gunshot, if it's combat trauma, maybe it's a specific cologne, if it's some sort of assault, that brings up that negative memory. And basically, our memory system has become a little bit too sensitive with all of those stimuli associated with that original trauma. The way that we actually treat this is using something known as exposure therapy. This is kind of the gold standard first line treatment for treating PTSD. So basically what they do is they have you come in and you'll do therapy sessions and they'll basically bring up the previous cues and try to have you calm down or relax to them. So try to take away the negative association from those stimuli. So the sound of a gunshot now is going to not necessarily just bring up fear, but now it's going to be brought up in a safe environment and you're going to feel more relaxed after it. And you just do this over and over and over again. It's the same type of theory for exposure therapy for phobias. So for example, I am terrified of heights. And so what I do every single day when I am teaching on campus is I try to walk over this high bridge that scares me. And so this is the same premise for PTSD. Basically, you're bringing up that memory again, and then you are trying to now associate it with something that is not horrifying. And what's interesting here is that this type of therapy is actually basically forming a new memory. So it is not unlearning that old memory. It is basically, instead of saying this memory is linked to fear, now you're like, this memory is linked to nothing. And so us drug scientists have been trying to figure out what drugs could work best to help with this type of exposure therapy. It doesn't work for about half of people, so how can we make it better? And we've seen that things like Molly work extremely well with things like exposure therapy for PTSD. So you're taking advantage of the fact that Molly reduces negative emotions, like that's just part of what the drug does, and then using that to the benefit in therapy. And so other researchers were like, okay, Molly might help with this, but what about things like weed? And here's why they thought that. So weed works on the endocannabinoid system. So we have a system in our brain, natural endocannabinoids, so endo from within, cannabinoids. And what you see is that weed is working on those systems, and those systems are strongly linked to things like extinction learning. So if you block this system, extinction doesn't happen. And if you increase this system, extinction learning seems to be more reliable. Like you can make it happen more easily. And it is working in the same brain areas that we see are linked to extinction learning too. So things like the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is necessary to actually store this new memory that you're making, and the prefrontal cortex is necessary for forming this new association. The specific study that I want to talk about is looking to see if low dose versus higher dose edibles might work to help with extinction learning. They found previously that a low dose did, but they're like, is the effect better with a higher dose? So this study ended up with 61 right-handed people to do their research on. And I say right-handed people because that's what they study. And this is one of the number one questions that gets brought up in my neuroscience classes, like why only right-handed people? Well, when you're doing brain scans, what happens is that if you are a left-handed person, you have different types of patterns of activation. So for left-handed people, you might see more activation in your right hemisphere than you would see for a right-handed person. So instead of just trying to get a whole bunch of left-handed people, they basically said, we don't care about them, whatever, we'll only use right-handed people. So this leads me to my conspiracy theory that we might just invalidate all of our findings for left-handed people if we actually do the research on them, because we just don't do the research on them. But honestly, we didn't do research on women in clinical trials until 1994, and we only required it in preclinical trials in 2016. So I don't have a good sense of hope for the left-handed people. So we took right-handed people who did not have a risk of psychosis and also did not use any other drugs. And also they had to, quote, not be afraid of snakes, which made me worried because I was like, where are you going with this? What are you going to make these people do? And then I learned. So they had to fill out the snake avoidance questionnaire, which I love because it is named SNAQ, and I feel like it's pronounced SNEC. Are you afraid of snakes? If so, you cannot participate. And what they found was that they had over 100 people to start out with, and then they ended up with barely any people. So basically 11 per group, because there were people who were claustrophobic from the fMRIs that they had to go into. There were people who were afraid of snakes. There were people who had used drugs. There were a whole bunch of flakes who just never showed up for anything. And then there were people that they questioned their validity in their interview questions. So I'm just guessing that these are lying liars. And after that, 36 people with PTSD made it through with all of those exclusions. And here's what they did to them. So basically, they had them use an Oculus Rift to go into a VR setting in which they would see a series of like bags, so like messenger bags of different colors. So there was red, yellow, and blue. Also, apologies for the farm animals in the background. It is too nice to be inside right now, but my ducks and my roosters, of which I have too many, are way too loud. So anyways, they had 3 book bags and 2 of them would produce a snake. So you would basically like be in this Oculus Rift like VR setting in this environment, and all of a sudden you would see this red messenger bag open up and snake would come and like go at you and attempt to bite you in this virtual reality setting. And then if you open the blue bag, you would see a snake again. And then if you open the yellow bag, there was no snake. And then a day later, they would come back in and basically be in a brain scanner and look at the same book bags. And so when they opened them up, now you never got a snake. That was the extinction learning. And what they did was they gave people either 5 or 10 milligrams of dronabinol, which is basically like a synthetic THC. So they gave that to them 2 hours before they put them in the scanner, and then asked a whole bunch of questions like, were you afraid of a potential snake? How did you feel about the effects of this drug? Did you like or dislike the substance? And there's also a placebo control here, appropriately. And so what they found was the dose did not matter for how afraid they felt. So either the low or the high dose, both of them decreased fear. But the patterns of brain activation did change based on the dose. So the 5 milligram dose produced brain changes within that first session. And then the 10 milligram dose produced brain changes about a week later. So they both worked, but they worked for different types of timelines. So this could be good if like you're trying this in a therapeutic setting where you might have long delays in between settings. You might want to use a higher dose during that setting. So yes, it does seem like edibles may help with PTSD. Now we need a lot more research on this. So we need to actually look at like how people are using this. We need to look at other doses. We need to look at other methods, but promising new results that could help with PTSD treatment in the future if it's allowed.